Alrighty, hi. Thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Alex Stapp. I'm the Director of Technology Policy at the Progressive Policy Institute. PPI is a moderate center-left think tank based in Washington, D.C. that works on a wide variety of public policy issues. While we're excited to host the event today, I just want to note from the outset that PPI did not take a position on Prop 22, which is what we're here to talk about today. We support a federal solution to providing gig worker security and benefits, primarily focused on equalizing the tax treatment between contractors and full-time employees. But we're excited to have a great conversation today. I think there's a lot to be learned from the fight in California over AB5 and Prop 22. And so I'm happy to have our guests here today. And as our panelists, we have Ruth Bernstein, who's the CEO of EMC Research, which is she's a pollster for Lyft. We have Heather Foster, Head of Policy Engagement and Strategic Partnerships for Lyft. And then we have Hari Sevgan, political consultant on Prop 22 and former National Press Secretary to the Democratic National Committee. Thanks everyone for being here.
Hey, Alec.
So before we get into so for our audience, Prop 22 did pass this cycle. Before we get into the reasons why Prop 22 succeeded, I just want to talk about what this actually did. And so Heather, you were at Lyft during this as a coalition was being put together. What does Prop 22 do? What did AB5 do, the bill that it was affecting? And why was Prop 22 put on the ballot?
Well, thanks for having me today. My name is Heather Foster, Head of Strategic Partnerships and our Policy Engagement here at Lyft. And yes, Prop 22, one of the biggest things that we worked on this year when we were really thinking through how can we do what's best for our drivers. And so we listened to a lot of drivers across the state. I know I personally, before even joining Lyft, spent a lot of time talking to drivers. And the one thing that they said over and over again was that they really appreciated the flexibility. And so we saw when a bill like AB5 came out, where there was basically discussion around what type of benefits would come to workers, how are we classifying them? The thing that we heard over and over again from our drivers were that they wanted to remain independent. And so to do this, we created this prop that basically allowed them to keep the flexibility with their driving and their hours, but also give them historic new benefits and protections as drivers. And so now with the passage of Prop 22, we're seeing where our drivers in the state of California now have access to insurance, accident insurance. They're now able to access health benefits, which they all have mentioned were, particularly important. And then also, they have a new safety courses and protections as drivers against sexual harassment or any type of harassment or discrimination on the platform.
That's great. And so I'll bring Hari into the conversation. Hari, you're a longtime Democratic strategist. Prop 22 was pretty much uniformly opposed by Democratic office holders and the political establishment in California. And this is in a year, obviously, when Joe Biden won the state by more than 30 points and won the national election. You talk about the obstacles in your path as you were trying to win this campaign?
Sure, happy to. Let's start with what I think most people would think would be an obstacle, but actually was not. And that was the role of the companies that were employing these gig workers, the drivers. There's been a lot of conversation about drivers and Uber and Lyft and DoorDash. Over in the public's mind, there's a certain conception of these folks. And we thought that might be an obstacle, and that actually was not what voters cared about. Really was what drivers cared about. Not that, it was, we wanted the companies to be out front as the face of this, but really this was about drivers. But it wasn't as motivating as we thought it would be. But what was an obstacle is what you laid out, Alec, which is the Democratic establishment in the state was generally uniformly lined up. Joe Biden, who won the state by 30 points, had endorsed the no position on Prop 22. There was this sort of disconnect, however, between that Democratic establishment and Democratic voters, and more broadly, the general electorate. There's a disconnect between sort of this, the sort of elite coverage, what you might read on Twitter, and where voters were. And then that was a challenge in a lot of ways because the coverage was driven by what people were saying on Twitter and what they were hearing from their sources in the State House. And then the final challenge really was in the wording of the ballot label itself, which changed in the middle of the campaign, pretty late in the campaign, actually, in the middle of the summer, which went from a relatively neutral, agreed upon set of languages that described what Prop 22 did, what it didn't do, its fiscal impact, to language that was pretty heavily weighted towards the no side. What we saw when that label was changed by the Attorney General's office in July is where we had 47% support prior to that label change, just on a plain reading of Prop 22. 47% of voters supported the yes position, 38% opposed. That switched after that ballot label to 28% supporting, 54% opposing. So it dramatically shifted the landscape. So that was, in the end, the biggest obstacle was the language. But the sentiment amongst the electorate generally was towards Prop 22.
And can you talk more about how the language changed?
Yeah, have to. So the initial, as Heather was laying out, the initial language laid out exactly what Prop 22 did. It created a classification for drivers that would allow them to retain their flexibility as independent contractors, but provide them with benefits. Those benefits include a wage floor. It included access to healthcare if they met a certain amount of hours driven. It included other safety protections. The language that was inserted in July changed that to say that Prop 22 was actually creating an exception to existing labor laws, which is a matter of dispute, certainly, but was not the neutral kind of language that existed before.
Great, thank you. So it's really helpful to inform. And I like your point earlier about the disconnect between Twitter and the average voter. And I think we saw that not just in Prop 22 in California, but we saw that throughout the election cycle this year, where you had Joe Biden winning the primary when people thought his voters weren't enthusiastic enough, or they weren't online enough, or he didn't get what was going on. And then he's triumphant in the primary. And then in the election, obviously Donald Trump is the most online candidate ever. And Biden ran a very quiet, more focused campaign, focusing on the average voter, I think. And that was obviously successful in the end as well. So I think there's interesting parallels that you brought out there. Ruth, you conducted polling for the Yes on 22 campaign. What did you see that was important to voters as they heard arguments from both sides?
Thank you, and thank you for having us on. Yeah, we were conducting polling late, tracking polls for Lyft toward the end. And what we saw, it was really clear. What voters were looking for is, what do the drivers want? They wanted to have the drivers' backs, and the majority of voters believed that what drivers wanted was to remain independent, as Heather was saying. And so I think that's the biggest piece, is that voters in California wanted drivers to get benefits, but also to retain the independence that they wanted. The other piece, I think, that voters were looking for, as I think Kari alluded to, the companies that provide these services are actually pretty well liked in California: Lyft, Uber, DoorDash, others. And especially during COVID, when more and more people are sort of relying on delivery and other services, and remembering, like, oh, how much did they were using rideshare a lot before COVID, and know that they're eventually going to go back to that. And I think really value the service and wanted to make sure that was going to continue to be available, and that those services, especially like delivery of food during COVID, was going to continue to be available. So I think the biggest piece of the drivers, but I don't want to also ignore the fact that these companies went from being completely non-existent a little over 10 years ago to actually being very well known, and a huge convenience for a lot of people in California.
That's great. And was there polling done about the gig companies before the whole Prop 22 debate started, or was this like the first time these questions had been polled and you guys were gathering the first kind of data? Yes, there was. This is not new, right, to be asking about the companies. So. Mm-hmm. And you found consistent results across what had previously been out there?
What we saw, and we weren't doing a lot of the early polling, but I've done other similar polling, and their rating was not changing during the campaign. The ratings of the companies were not changing during the campaign, which you would think, with all the amount of spending, that people's attitudes about the companies would change, and they really were not.
Right, and I can't even help but again another analogy to the national election where we saw very little movement between Biden and Trump throughout the campaign, even though there was hundreds of millions of dollars spent on both sides and lots of campaigning. So it's interesting that there's similar stabilities in voter opinion. So now, Heather, I want to shift a little bit to the kind of that final outcome. So the initiative won with more than 58% of the vote, so it passed. What do you think drove that margin from your perspective?
Well, I think that margin had totally to do with the coalition of support for Prop 22. When you think about it, it was a broad coalition. It wasn't necessarily just one specific group that you saw championing this, but across the board, as Ruth has mentioned, as Hari has mentioned, there are a lot of people that have used these platforms. So they see the benefit. And then also we saw across the board that our drivers, once again, were very vocal about the ways that they wanted to keep their flexibility. And so seeing a coalition of support from everyone from, the California Peace Officers Association to, the League of United Latin American Citizens Council to, I would say, also just the California Chamber of Commerce, so those who you would normally see supporting this type of proposition, but also, as I mentioned, a broad coalition because different types of communities really rely on this use of transportation, but then also the drivers in themselves have been vocal about the benefits of being independent and also being able to access benefits.
Well, thank you. And now that you mentioned some different subgroups there, I want to go back to Ruth and talk about how Heather just said that we saw higher than expected support among Democrats, union households, and communities of color. So what do you think we learned about the different voter groups from these results?
What we learned that there were differences within the Democrats, and I think that Democrats are a large population in California, right? and even our independent voters, many of them lean Democratic, and so it's a blue state, right? So no surprise that Republicans were supportive of this. I think not, less regulation, it made sense. But what we saw in Democrats is kind of an interesting split. We saw a lot of voters of color were majority support and were supported more supportive than white voters. Where we were seeing kind of the most opposition was really with the real progressives, those who self-identified as progressives, as opposed to being liberal or moderate Democrats. And liberal and moderate Democrats are the vast majority of Democrats in the state. It was progressive voters, a lot of them younger, and even some who use the platforms, but they were kind of it was more of an attitudinal opposition, but we saw working class voters and moderate Democrats, and like I said, liberal Democrats were actually a majority of supportive. And when you look at the actual election results throughout the state, you can see there's a real demographic difference. So for instance, in Los Angeles, there was less support in, kind of the Beverly Hills, Santa Monica, wealthier, whiter communities, but in the more working class parts of LA, a majority support for the measure. So some real differences.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that liberals and moderates are the majority of the party, because as someone who spends way too much time on Twitter, I often feel like I'm in the minority, and that as a member of the more moderate wing of the party relative to the left wing of the party, I think I'm outnumbered. But then, the data seems to show that that's actually the reverse is the case. And so, Hari, I want to talk to you for a little about the spending on both sides of this issue. So many analysts who have observed this result are crediting the victory to the Yes campaign's massive spending. And what's your response to that? Because I think the Yes campaign did outspend the No campaign by quite a significant margin.
Couple things. One, very generally, I would say spending makes a difference. I don't think anyone should argue that spending doesn't make a difference. However, it's not dispositive, right? I mean, just ask Governor Meg Whitman whether spending is dispositive of victory or not. It simply isn't. Or even in this cycle, the folks who spent over $60 million to not pass Prop 15, the split roll proposition in California. So spending is important, but it can't overcome the fundamentals, right? And the fundamentals in this race in 22 and is that drivers overwhelmingly wanted to retain their flexibility. There was a rideshare guys survey that showed that drivers by a 4-to-1 margin wanted to retain their flexibility. Our internal polling show that drivers supported maintaining their flexibility and getting benefits, sort of this new classification that is under 22. They supported Prop 22's general measures in our internal polling. Those measures. 62% of voters in a January survey that we conducted supported the measures under Prop 22. All of those numbers are before we spent $1 on paid advertising, right? So the fundamentals here are that people supported the drivers, and they understood that the drivers wanted flexibility and benefits, which is what Prop 22 offered. So ultimately, even after the ballot label changed and we saw support add significantly, we had a foundation to build from, which was that people supported the concept of what we were trying to do, which is create classification that gave drivers what they wanted: flexibility, security, benefits.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense to me. And so I think I also want to follow up a little more with Ruth on the polling, because I think you've hinted a little bit about how this issue kind of crossed partisan lines. You had some moderate Democrats and obviously many Republicans who supported Prop 22, and it kind of transcended other tribal affiliations or divisions that we usually see. And so why do you think this issue has resonated across these traditional divisions?
I think it's because it's about the drivers. And I think that what voters felt like that this was what drivers wanted. I mean, that was a lot of the communication in the campaign. As Hari said, we certainly can't ignore the amount of communication. And I think also that the communication really it supported what many voters probably think now. So if you're going to take a rideshare, you're going to get in a car with a total stranger and trust that person to drive you, right? To drive you around. And so when that driver, and maybe when you voted, you're thinking about one driver or not, or you heard about someone, but you're trusting, and you're already trusting that driver to be in their car. And now you're trusting that the driver is saying, this is actually better for me. I think that there's a familiarity of the story. So the communication really focused on putting a face on the drivers and talking about the drivers. And it was familiar to Californians, right? You're not talking about an issue like some of the other measures on the ballot that were dialysis that are maybe more confusing for people. This is an issue that they're familiar with, right? I've been in a car with a driver. The driver is saying that he wants to be part-time because I've sat in the car with the driver and he's told me about how he's in school, or he drives at night while works another job during the day. So I think it's it's something that voters are familiar with. And when the communication was very focused on putting that face, I think voters recognized it and said, yeah, this makes sense. I'm hearing something that makes sense. Drivers want to be independent, and this is what it's going to give them, and it's going to give them benefits. And so that's how I feel like that this came about.
Well, and as you're giving the details there, I couldn't help but think of like the classic Michael Jordan line of Republicans buy sneakers too. And so like this is a classic case where a wide swath of people, almost everyone uses ride sharing at one point or another, either just for one-off trips or as a regular part of the commute. And so that kind of, I think, crosses party lines in that way. So it makes sense why people might feel similarly about it. And so now, Heather, I want to ask, so obviously COVID is the main thing that people talk about at most events these days. It's so prominent. And so has COVID-19, it's profoundly changed this country, including how we work. And so how did the pandemic affect the way Californians think about these issues?
Yeah, I mean, we've mentioned flexibility over and over again, but it's never been more crystallized than this year, right? So many people who are doing rideshare, they have to think about, when can I drive? When is it optimal for me? And at a time when everyone is having shifting schedules, some people have to be able to make sure that they can get home to, help their kids with Zoom school. Or, we saw where some drivers had moved in with their parents to take care of them, or caretakers. So we saw more and more that our drivers needed flexible times. We've heard this a lot from the coalition members, who also saw that we're living in an age where people are relying on the transportation. If you think about it, so many of our traditional public modes of transportation have changed, right? So people still need to be able to get to the grocery store. They particularly relied on rideshare for essential services, essential trips. We saw that over and over and over again this year. And so because of that, I think it really resonated, that message of, okay, people do need the flexibility. And it's whether you are a passenger or whether you are a driver. Everyone is saying that we now live in a world where we can't be as regimented. The rules have changed, and everyone is looking for that type of flexibility that's so critical to succeeding, I believe, in this new COVID world.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that makes sense to me. So Ruth, what do you think are the takeaways for political observers as they try to understand the 22 campaign?
Well, there are a lot of things that I think are useful. There are a lot of things that most campaigns can't ever repeat, right? So a lot of I think this is in a somewhat unique situation, and certainly the money that was spent is most campaigns aren't going to be doing that. But one thing that we see overall from this election is really the role that voting early played and voting at home. So, and I'm, kind of referring to other research that we're doing as well. When the awareness of Prop 22 was massive. So we saw a really rapid, because of the communication, increase in people just knew what was going on. And because people in California, everyone had a ballot mailed to them at home, and they voted early this time. And what we're seeing is that I think voters really were taking the time to think about how to vote and looking for information. And as you think about it, you're sitting down to vote, you have your ballot, and you realize, wait, I have my computer right next to me. I can Google, I can learn about things. And so what we were seeing is that voters knew what they were voting for. They understood, they were aware of it. They knew that the drivers supported it. And I think, and they knew many of the components. So when we asked questions about, why are you voting yes, there was some substance about it. I'm not saying that if we brought every voter in and had a seminar, they would know everything. But I think it just speaks to the voters want to be thoughtful. They want to do the right thing, and they want to do the research. And when we give people more time to actually vote at home, they can do that. And we have to be ready for that as consultants. We have that information and have it early and have it available for them.
Yeah, it's nice. It's nice when voters have the right information and have more information. So I think, nobody can be opposed to that. That's for sure. So Hari, you're the political consultant here. So do you think that the success of 22 should tell us something about how progressives need to respond to the changing economy, or is it kind of a one-off?
I think there are lessons here. Some of them are plain. Taking a position in opposition to a measure that would save 900,000 jobs is not a winning proposition. Taking a position against a measure that would save the ability of restaurants to make deliveries during a pandemic is probably not a winning proposition. I think those are some basic economic arguments that you win, but there are some, I think, more philosophical lessons here to learn as well. I think the first is progressives, we're progressive. We should be looking to the future. Relying on dichotomies of the past, whether it's how we define employment or not, or who's an employee and who's not, in a changing economy, doesn't work. We should be seizing the future and defining the future before that future defines all of us. And I think that's what 22 did in creating a classification that responds to our values, that creates flexibility, but also offers benefits and security. That's the first, is look forward, not backward. I think the other lesson here is we have to have an agenda that is set from the bottom up, not from the top down. When we take an agenda that comes from Twitter or comes from somewhere other than the constituency that it affects, I think we're in a bad spot as progressives. In this case, drivers overwhelmingly, it wasn't close. It wasn't 51-49. We're talking 60s, 70s here. Drivers overwhelmingly wanted to keep their flexibility, but also have access to benefits. That's what they wanted. And it's not just drivers, it's other communities that we should be thinking about in the front of our minds. Communities of color in this campaign were overwhelmingly in support of Prop 22. Heather mentioned some of the coalition. It was a broad, vast coalition. It was the NAACP. It was local pastors. It was folks in the community saying that they wanted Prop 22. Ultimately, voters of color supported Prop 22 55-38, right? If we are going to set an economic agenda, it should come from the constituencies that we're trying to serve. And I think that's the biggest lesson.
Well, that's a great principle, and I definitely agree with that. And so I think we're about to close out here. We have one more question, and I'll give the final question to Heather. And so I mentioned at the outset that PPI as an organization, our position, and we've done our own policy white papers on this, is that we support a federal solution primarily focused on equalizing the tax treatment of benefits for both gig workers who currently get no tax advantages or very few tax advantages, and full-time employees who get tons of tax advantages right now for the benefits they receive. So we want to equalize those things and then create a portable system where workers can work for multiple platforms, collect benefits at all of them, and it accrues into one single account in proportion to the amount they work. And they can use those benefits in a cafeteria style plan however they want. So that's the kind of position that PPI supports nationally. I'm curious, like, when we view it as a third way, we view it as a compromise or a third position. I'm curious, is this third way, keeping independence, access to benefits, is something that Lyft supports across the country, or do you view this as a state by state thing, or are you satisfied with Prop 22 in California? Now it's over. How do you view the future of this kind of fight?
Well, we are very satisfied with what happened in California in terms of the win of Prop 22, but we're also going to continue to listen to our drivers across the country. And I think in states where we see the support, we will continue to work on these type of solutions. As kind of Hari mentioned, is one of the big takeaways from this was that we were creating jobs and we were saving jobs. And this has been a huge win economically for the state of California. I think you saw that turnout from communities because people knew at a time where there are so many industries shedding jobs right now. People are really looking to make sure that they can, create an income for themselves. And so as we see these opportunities expand across the country, we are going to continue to do our best to work with legislators and other stakeholders across the country to provide a solution for drivers.
That sounds great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Hari. I appreciate your time, and thank you to our audience for tuning in. I think it was a great event. We